I decided, well, it really was the out, the side product of a failed romance back in my senior year of high school. I fell desperately in love with a young woman, and I wanted to be so special for her. I wanted to be something above the cut of the ordinary. So I just said, I'm going to be an artist. I want to be an artist. I want to be a world-renowned artist just to prove how special I was for her. And so that became my goal, to become an artist. And so over the course of, this was late 60s and on into the 70s, I pursued that. And as an avocation, I lost the girl, but just out of spite, I said, well, damn it, I'm going to be an artist anyway. So in 1970, that whole ambition got sidetracked because I was drafted. I got caught in the draft, military draft. And I spent 16 months as a pay clerk in the Army Finance Office on Okinawa. And over the course of that, I was in the military. I did not have a high clearance to secret projects, and I have none of that background at all. I just did my time. Got a discharge in 1972, and over the course of time, my parents had relocated from Ohio to Arizona. And so after my discharge, I resumed living with my parents for a time here in Tucson, Arizona. And I must tell you, it was like culture shock to come from Midwestern Flatlands, Ohio, to Tucson, Arizona, the Wild West, and it was actually like going to another planet. I was like, this was so different from from the world I had left in Ohio. But over the next few years, I got to really love the Arizona desert, and I began painting Arizona landscape paintings and selling them. I worked for about 5 years as a fine arts landscape artist, and really loved the scenery here, and it's just incredible. But over the course of 5 years, and when you're an artist, you have to keep making product constantly. So it's like I was selling my art, but at the same time, I was like, became very repetitive. So after 5 years of painting, mountains and rocks and saguaros and mountains and rocks and saguaros, I was getting kind of burnt out on it. So, thinking back to my childhood and all those Hollywood movies, so many of those movies had UFOs flying in the desert. And it's like, here I am painting desert scenes. Why did I stick a UFO in it just for fun? So I did. And I can remember just just out of curiosity, I wanted to see what the public reaction would be to one of my desert paintings, if it had a flying saucer in it. So I was at a mall show, and one of my desert paintings had a flying saucer in it. And I was expecting people to laugh at it. I was expecting ridicule of that painting. But the reaction was totally different. I was not prepared for the reaction I got. And people were fascinated by it. And that painting was like a magnet. I was just floored by how people reacted to my desert painting with a flying saucer in it. And it so impressed a young man here in town who was a son of a prominent automotive dealer here, that he commissioned me to do a painting based on a personal sighting that he had here in the Tucson's Catalina Mountains. So by default, so I did. He described his UFO encounter, and I did a painting based on that, which he purchased. And so by default, I was starting to become a UFO artist, investigator, researcher without realizing it. So after that, I started to do more, science fiction kind of themes, just to keep my artistry fresh and interesting for me. And if you're any kind of an illustrator, you're always looking for source material. So what I would always haunted the bookstores and so forth, looking for art books and so forth that had really interesting images in it that would kind of inspire my creativity. And in the spring of 1980, I happened to be in a Walden bookstore and was browsing through the science fiction kind of art books. And there on a shelf was this big picture book with a photograph on the cover with a beautiful flying saucer in the photograph on the book cover. And the title was UFO Contact from the Pleiades, Volume 1, and it was a big picture book. So I opened it up, and it was a folio of astounding UFO photographs. And I thought, well, these pictures are way too good to be true. But even if they are, I said, this is great source material for the kind of stuff, the kind of artwork I like to do. So I bought the book, took it home, read it, and to my amazement, I discovered it was the chronicle of a UFO contact case that was being investigated in Switzerland at that time by a retired lieutenant colonel from the United States Air Force named Wendell C. Stevens, who by the merest coincidence just happened to live in Tucson, Arizona also. So I was just really intrigued by this book. And I thought to myself, well, I would really like to meet this Wendell Stevens guy. And it's like I had no more formed that thought in my mind when through a series of synchronous associations, I got invited to meet Wendell Stevens, like 2 weeks later. So, get in the car. I'm going out to meet for the very first time a real UFO investigator, and I remember thinking at the time, I said, what if this guy turns out to be a real flake? Well, one of those guys that wears aluminum foil on his head and talks to the Space Brothers. It's like, so, well, Wendell Stevens was not like that at all. He was a retired Air Force professional. He was a pilot. He had been involved in air technical research. He'd flown in combat in World War II. His expertise was foreign aircraft technology. And he had been researching, at that point, he'd been researching UFOs for 20 years. And he had the world's largest collection of UFO photographs. So there I was in his studio on a Saturday morning, hearing Wendell tell about his investigation, the contact in the Pleiades, and a Swiss farmer, a one-armed Swiss farmer, who had been taking the world's most incredible UFO photographs going back to 1975. I was impressed with Wendell's genuine enthusiasm. He just exuded excitement about this case. He had been, I think by the time I met him, he'd already made 3 trips to meet this man in Switzerland personally. And Wendell was totally forthright. He was not like, well, I could tell you this stuff, but you'd have to pay me. It was not like that at all. He was like, this is the story. I'm here to tell it to the world. And he had the photographs. He had the eyewitness accounts of more than 30 people who had also seen the craft. He had access to metal samples, sound recordings, and landing tracks, photographs of landing tracks. And Wendell was meticulous about the details of his research. And Wendell had gone to Switzerland after Wendell had originally seen these photographs, and he came to the same conclusion I did, that they're too damn good to be true. These can't be real. Up to that point, UFO photographs are just random one-time shots, then they're usually fuzzy and blurry and indistinct and totally inconclusive as evidence. The Billy Meier photographs were totally different. Full color, as if the flying saucers had deliberately posed for him. And according to Billy's testimony, they had done just that. So I was utterly amazed and impressed by Wendell's professionalism. And over the course of him sharing the details of this UFO case in Switzerland, he shared that they didn't have photographs, that the contactee was not allowed to photograph the ship landed on the ground, and he was not allowed to photograph the occupants. So a little light bulb went on in my head. Well, I'm an artist. I'm a UFO illustrator. I would be happy to lend my skills, Wendell, to help you, share this case. So that's exactly how I got involved with UFO research, serious UFO research, and serious UFO illustrations back in the spring of 1980.
One of the peculiarities of the Swiss contact case was that the visiting aliens did not permit the farmer Billy Meier to photograph either their ships parked on the ground or the aliens themselves. Ha! Here was an opportunity for me to join Wendell's investigation as an illustrator. So based on photographs in hand of the spaceships, coupled with Billy's description of the extraterrestrials, I fashioned a preliminary rendering of how a landed Pleiadian beam ship and its pilot might look. In turn, Wendell carried a snapshot of this painting for Billy to critique on his next visit to Switzerland. Here you can see the corrections Billy sketched onto the photograph, and ultimately how I incorporated those changes into my finished painting. Of course, this was not to be my only UFO painting inspired by contact from the Pleiades, which remains to this day my favorite UFO case. Over the next 10 years, I busied myself with many more UFO illustrations, some based on actual cases, some based on historical speculation, and some just for fun.
So like I said, I wanted to lend my skills to Wendell to help illustrate the Billy Meier contact. And so probably the first, except for the painting I did for the young man who had the sighting here in Tucson, that was my first really serious piece of UFO illustration. And it was, I did a rendering showing the Pleiadian beam ship landed on the ground, and with the Pleiadian pilot, her name was Samyasi, a young woman, in the foreground with Billy off to the side, Billy Meyer. That was my first rendering. And I wanted to make sure it was as authentic to Billy Meyer's account as possible. So I took a snapshot of my original illustration, and I gave it to Wendell, and Wendell, on his next trip to Switzerland, showed it to Billy Meyer, the snapshot. And this is the only contact with Billy Meyer was through Wendell. Billy sketched some corrections on the photograph, and then Wendell brought it back to me, and then I incorporated those corrections into the final painting. But that painting was my really first serious introduction to UFO illustrations, and I did several more UFO illustrations for Wendell based on other cases, but none of his other cases had the fascination to me as the Billy Meyer contact. So meeting Wendell Stevens and getting involved in his UFO research, especially with the Billy Meyer case, it seemed to me at the time that we're sitting in the most astounding UFO case of all time. And here I am become a part of it. And Wendell had this UFO disclosure in his hip pocket. I mean, it was a slam dunk. I mean, Wendell had all this material that he'd accumulated over the course of his research, that this was a legitimate case. But what I suddenly started to realize that people were starting to come out of the woodwork to debunk the Billy Meyer case. And Wendell had been involved. They had produced a theatrical film, which outlined the details of his research into the Meyer case, and it was scheduled for theatrical release. But just prior to its release, people came out of the woodwork to file copyright lawsuits against it. So the film was never released publicly. You can go online now and watch it. It's called Contact, but which recounts Wendell's entire investigation into the Billy Meyer case. And this is where I started to realize there was a serious disconnect, where no matter how good your evidence is to prove a case, people will always come out of the woodwork to make it a non-case, to make it a non-event, to make sure that it's all shunted off into urban legend. So there's no such, this is not true. And over the course of years after my involvement deepened into UFO research, I saw this pattern happen over and over and over. No matter how good your research is, no matter how good your evidence is, it always gets debunked. It always gets shunted off into an urban legend fantasy. It's like, no, there's no such thing. So at the end of the day, nothing out of the ordinary exists. The government, standard claim against UFOs always wins the day.
In 1986, Wendell Stevens followed up his extensive Pleiades UFO contact investigation by publishing a volume entitled UFO Crash at Aztec. Within this book was a short addendum that chronicled an alleged German Luftwaffe program during World War II to build circular vertical lift aircraft. In other words, flying saucers. This was an astounding revelation to me, since up to that point I was convinced that flying saucers, if they were real at all, were piloted by aliens from outer space. Saucers built by the Third Reich? The idea itself was more exotic than space aliens, and yet a tantalizing trail of circumstantial evidence at least suggested the idea was plausible. Within the pages of Wendel's Aztec book was a schematic design of one of those German saucers, and based on that design, I set about to create a painting of how that craft might have looked at a real test flight facility. You must understand, this illustration was not done as any kind of political endorsement for the Third Reich, but rather to marvel at German technical skill, and, as with all of my UFO art, to explore another possible explanation to the UFO mystery. Well, I must have struck a universal chord, because since 1991, when I first painted that German flying saucer, that particular image has become, much to my utter astonishment, perhaps the most iconic Jim Nichols UFO art illustration in the world.
So it was great fun. I thought this is the joy of being an artist. UFOs and flying saucers are such a visual experience, and one of the things I was always frustrated with UFO books is all they did was talk about it, and you didn't see it. I said, well, damn it, I'm an illustrator. I want to see it. I want to see what this thing looks like. So I painted this rendering, my first rendering of a German saucer, and displayed it at Wendel's first International UFO Congress here in Tucson back in 1991. And this is one of the few original paintings that I have done that there was a German gentleman at the conference who absolutely insisted that he buy that painting. So I don't think it was even dry yet. And I had it on display, and this man was absolutely fascinated by it. And he says he had to have it. I must have this painting. So I said, okay, well, I can always paint another for myself later. So I sold my original of that painting, but I still have a second version of it. Ironically, that painting over the years has become probably the most internationally famous Jim Nichols UFO art painting in the world. That painting is been on book covers, video covers, you name it. It's been photoshopped into all kinds of other illustrations. The whole fascination with German flying saucers from World War II has become one of the biggest UFO mythologies in the world, and it seemed the fascination with this seems to grow exponentially every year. And I thought, when I did that original painting, I had no idea the impact that would have over the years.